Welcome to the Real Python Podcast. This is episode 213. What are discrete optimization problems? And how do you solve them with constraint programming in Python? Christopher Trudeau is back on the show this week, bringing another batch of PyCoder's weekly articles and projects. Christopher discusses an article about constraint programming using Python. He describes the fundamentals and how the problems resemble logic problems you may have experienced in school. The article shows how to solve a weekly work scheduling problem using the open source CPSat package. We discuss Leodanis Pozo Ramos' recent tutorial, Python's built-in functions, a complete exploration. These are all the functions available for you to use directly in your Python code without importing. We also share several other articles and projects from the Python community, including a news roundup, spotting ships with satellites, grappling with Apple's App Store rejecting Python applications, considering changes to Python's security model, discussing pivoting from one development path to another, prettifying Jinja and Django templates, and generating static sites with Python. This episode is sponsored by Sentry. Sentry provides end-to-end distributed tracing, enabling developers to identify and debug performance issues and errors across their systems and services. All right, let's get started. The Real Python Podcast is a weekly conversation about using Python in the real world. My name is Christopher Bailey, your host. Each week, we feature interviews with experts in the community and discussions about the topics, articles, and courses found at realpython.com. After the podcast, join us and learn real-world Python skills with a community of experts at realpython.com. Hey, Christopher, welcome back.
Beautiful sunny day out there, nice and warm.
Yes, midsummer. Let's talk Python.
Sure. Why not? It's what we're here for.
Yeah, we got our topics and news and a discussion this week that I think will be kind of fun. So, you ready to dig in with some news?
Yeah, let's go. Few release bits. First off is Polars. They're a data frame library who are an increasingly popular alternative to pandas. They have just announced 1.0. This library actually uses semantic versioning, callback to episode 211.
Yep.
So the big one here is a signal from the maintainers that they actually feel the library is production ready. Although the post says they've gone 1.0, I actually couldn't find a 1.0 on their PyPy. It's already 1.1. I'm not sure why, but whatever. So it is. It doesn't look like there's a huge number of changes in here in comparison to their last release. I think they're just sort of stamping it that they've done their testing and that it seems stable. There are some performance improvements and a bunch of bugs got squished. So, progress. Next bit of release news is Psycopg 3.2 has come out. So this project is a database adapter for Postgres. So, for example, if you're using Postgres and Django, you're most likely using Psycopg underneath.
Yep.
This is a pretty solid library. It doesn't change very frequently. In fact, 3.2 was 2 years in the making. This release includes features for interacting with NumPy scalars, better support for Postgres parameters, and a new way to retrieve a single value out of the database. So this allows you to skip over. If you only need one thing, you don't have to get the tuple and get the thing outside of the tuple. You can actually say, I want just a single value. Still on the release news, Django issued a security notice for 5.07 and 4.2.14 has come out to fix some things. There's a fairly long list in here in comparison to usual. Usually these things only have one or two things in them. There are several different denial of service attacks, a possible directory listing exploit, and a enumerating users exploit. So if you're on Django, you should go take a look at these and get up to date. I suspect some security guy went through and started poking because usually these things don't just flare up out of nowhere. And then the final bit of news is the PyBay conference has opened its call for proposals. The deadline for talk submission is July 31st, and the conference is in San Francisco on September 21st. This is a regional conference, so it's a bit more cozy than a full-blown PyCon, but its proximity to Silicon Valley means it tends to punch way above its weight class. They tend to get a lot of sort of first-grade people in there to chat.
Yeah.
So if you're in the neighborhood, it's a neat little way to sort of mix with some of the Python names you might recognize in a slightly more intimate place.
Sweet.
So I understand you're starting off with a 12-part epic.
Well, it has the word complete in it.
And it's by Leodanis. So,
yeah, exactly. So yeah, this is by Leodanis Pozo Ramos. The title is Python's Built-in Functions, a complete exploration. So what can I say? It's in the title. It's a tutorial that's chock full of information. Each section could be its own mini tutorial on the fundamentals of a particular built-in function, complete with code examples. It's, again, one of these kind of things that's a really great reference spot for people who are developing their skills and want to expand them. I'm not sure if you would read it all the way through in one sitting kind of thing. It's definitely one of those things you'd maybe eat a section at a time as you continue through your learning. He starts with explaining the concept of built-in functions. And that word built-in, I think, can be confusing to some people that are coming to Python. There's a lot of stuff, quote unquote, built into Python. And so I want to just briefly, mention there's what we often call the Python standard library, or the batteries that are included. Those are the larger sort of world of what we're talking about, of modules, and those have to be imported. You have to bring them in. These are things like pathlib, OS, timeit, JSON, argparse, things that we've mentioned a lot on here. In fact, we just recently discussed Trey Hunter's exploration of Python's many command line utilities in episode 209. I'll include a couple links just to kind of throw that out. I have Python's module index. This is from Python's documentation. And then the built-in functions, which is a good, again, list showing the same kind of things, but with maybe less detailed explanation that Leodanis is doing here. These are functions available to you directly for you to use anywhere in your code. They don't require an import for you to use them. And many of the built-in functions, we've mentioned this, I think, a couple times also, they're actually classes with function style names. And so these classes can be called. Examples of this are like str for creating strings, or tuple, or list and dix. These are actually classes that define the sort of built-in data types. These classes are listed in the Python documentation as built-in functions, and you'll find them throughout the tutorial as you dig through it into this whole collection. The collection starts with, in my opinion, simpler functions that you can wrap your head around, including topics like working with these built-in data types. But as you go in further, you'll start to look at object-oriented stuff, the decorators, scopes, and then kind of talking about the larger idea of the import system. So he starts with the math-related ones. We've recently talked about them with your talk about the round tutorial recently. ABS for creating, getting the absolute value of something. Div mod, which is a fun one, which gives you not only the quotient, but the remainder and division. Min and max, all those kind of powerful things there. Then he kind of gets into manipulating basic data types, things like how are objects represented, the strings, the str and repr functions, processing Boolean values with bool, encoding strings with ORD and CHR, and dealing with bytes and bytes arrays, collection types, list, tuple, dict, set, and frozen sets, creating these frozen versions of those things to make them immutable. Processing iterables, iterators. We spent a lot of time talking about that, but that's where you'd find like len, determine the number of items in a container, or like the length of a string, things like that. Tools for that, like the functions reversed and sorted. So there's just everything. He can kind of get into it, which is really interesting that he's gone and given you examples, code to kind of look at how they kind of work, and explanations of each, along with potentially off-roads if this is something like, oh, I'm interested in the subject more. There's real Python tutorials on most of these things where you can kind of dig in and get a little bit further into it. As you go further, again, I mentioned this is where it kind of gets a little deeper, processing input and output, opening files, printing text, formatting strings, accepting user input, working with classes and objects. So these are all these functions that give you the ability to do that, working with scopes, the locals function, the globals function, introspection on objects, the ID function, or the dir, which shows you, checking your names and attributes and what are current variables and so forth. And then a couple of interesting ones that caution, the eval one and the exec one, things where you can actually execute expressions from strings or run code from strings. And so we've talked a little bit about that also. And then some miscellaneous ones like help and hash, and then a little bit about importing and so forth. So again, complete. He covered all the ones that are listed in there, which I think is really kind of cool. Favorites from the list there, Chris? Things that you want to call out?
Oh, exec. I can't live without exec. I exec things that exec things. It's no, not at all. I find it's interesting. Like I'll go through coding for a while where there'll be something that I don't use, and then I'll something will happen and I'll need it like 3 projects in a row.
Yeah.
Zip is one of those that I can go years without needing it, and somehow in the last 2 or 3 months I think I've used it 5 or 6 times. It's
there's a lot of those in the iterable section that are like that.
Yes.
It's like, oh my gosh, don't write your own. There's stuff here.
Yes.
Enumerate, zip, where it's going to basically bundle your iterators together, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. So I find it's an interesting hodgepodge, right? And it's almost like a little history lesson.
Oh, what's added and what's
what's there, what's not there, what's been wheeled away into a module now. I know the maintainers are very cautious about wanting to put things in here now.
Yeah.
Because if you add something, it's going to conflict with anybody who's got a function of that same name, right? So the default attitude about anything is stick it in a module now. So it's kind of interesting to sort of see, what's there, what's not there.
The functional programming stuff. I remember there's like a lot of debate over that filter and map.
Yes.
Because there are other ways to do them. So
yeah.
Check it out if you need it as a reference, or if you want to dig in and learn a little more about these different areas. One of those things that you can kind of approach maybe multiple times as you want to look at it. What's your first one?
My first article is by Mark Litwinchik, and it's called Satellites Spotting Ships. We've linked to Mark's stuff several times in PyCoders. He tends to write sort of detailed practical guides, usually around data analysis and geography mapping kinds of things, and this one's no different. So Umbra Space is a manufacturer and operator of synthetic aperture radar satellites. That's the kind of imaging tech that can see through clouds. And recently, Umbra had released over 1,000 images displaying ships around the world, almost a little over 7 terabytes of data to play with if you want to play. And Mark kind of wanted to play. So what this post does is it walks you through building a ship detection algorithm that processes these images. Most of the code is written in Python, but he does use a few other tools that are available as packages on Ubuntu. It doesn't mean you can't get those packages on other operating systems, but he uses dpackages in his example. So if you're following through and you're not using dpackage, you might have to figure a bit of that out for yourself. He uses DuckDB to store information. And then, so you do the processing, essentially add stuff to the database, do more processing, use the database to add stuff to the database. And in fact, he's using the JSON extension for DuckDB and essentially manipulating little JSON blobs. The satellite images are available on a public S3 bucket. So the little example actually starts with using code to go off and grab stuff out of S3. He actually uses the AWS command to do it. But if you didn't want to do that, there are Python libraries that you could do the same thing. Geography is complicated. One of the things he's trying to do is to figure out, what is a ship in the image and whose waters are they in. So there's a library called GeoPy. It takes about 20 lines of code to do this kind of processing. And he writes a JSON blob into the database that tracks everything to sort of figure all the coding out and starts to try to figure out where things are and what those boundaries are. With the initial data on each file ready, the next step is to figure out what the actual maritime boundaries are. There's a separate map package that has that. And so the article shows you how to process that and then add that information to the database. So you're very much sort of taking different pieces of data from different sources and trying to munge them all together in order to try and get all this information and solve the puzzle. And then the next step, once you've got all that stuff in place, is to actually do collision detection, because the image might actually overlap multiple maritime boundaries. So any single image might be in several different territories. Then the last part is to actually detect the ships. Mark has chosen to use YOLO version 5. He found some pre-trained data sets that kind of knew what a ship was already. So you had to do some local training, but not a lot. And you build out a model, and then you actually run that model to do the ship detection. And then, of course, once you've got all that information, you want to visualize it all. So he then takes those images and then superimposes little boxes over the thing saying, I think this is a ship, and I'm this confident that I think this is a ship. So Mark doesn't quite handhold as he goes along. This isn't a beginner's article, but if you're interested in a deeper dive, it's a cool little project and all the information's there. It's just if you've never touched Geo before, if you've never touched YOLO before, you might have to go digging for other articles first.
Yeah.
It does touch a lot of different disciplines. So, it's a neat little Saturday afternoon project if you want to learn more about geodata or machine learning. And it's fun to play with. So,
yeah, another project to play with, DuckDB.
Yes.
Which I've been talking about more and more lately.
Yeah.
Sentry provides end-to-end distributed tracing, enabling developers to identify and debug performance issues and errors across their systems and services. Their tracing offering focuses on proactive debugging rather than passive observability. It introduces a span-based tracing model, allowing developers to track the complete end-to-end path of requests, pinpointing issues across distributed systems and microservices. With the Trace Explorer, users can search specific traces using high cardinality data and debug efficiently with full context in the redesigned trace view, which provides detailed visibility of application requests and metrics. This approach helps identify and resolve performance bottlenecks quickly. Installing Sentry is simple, like 5 lines of code simple. Use the code REALPython during signup, and new users get 3 free months of the team plan. So when your code breaks, you can fix it fast. My next couple they're related in the sense that they are kind of the ins and outs of Python's development currently. The first one is a story from Joe Brockmeyer, and this is from LWN.net. The title is Python Grapples with Apple App Store Rejections. There's a change that happened from 3.11 to 3.12 that led to I don't know how many, Python apps being rejected from Apple's app stores. And it led to Eric Frumling submitting a bug report against CPython. And then this sort of is following this discussion with the core developers and the wider Python dev groups about like how should CPython as a project proceed with this weird problem. They ended up reaching a consensus, and then they are moving to have it set up in 3.13. But some of the details that were covered, software that's distributed in Apple's Mac OS store is sandboxed, and the sandboxing of apps therefore prohibit them from like installing other applications. And there's this scheme that's built in for Apple to be able to install additional apps. It's the ITMS-services scheme. ITMS is iTunes Music Store, which so it sounds kind of old, but they've used this scheme forever. And that string happens to be in the URL lib parser in Python standard library. Talking again about that. A URL scheme for apps that want Apple's App Store, so then that they can install yet another app. So previous guest, Russell Keith McGee, who's known for Beware and Briefcase projects, he's also really involved in getting iOS to be a supported platform for Python. We talked about that with PEP 730, which looks like it's scheduled for 3.13 also. So he's been kind of involved in this idea of getting applications not only to be running on Windows and Macs and Linux, but on these portable platforms also. So he started this discussion, and I'll just note that they came up with a few solutions. One was like, we'll obfuscate it, we'll hide the string in a way so they can't find it. Probably not the best way. Maybe we could have a configuration file that you do when you do your build. Or there could be a build time option that you throw a flag -- with -- app -- store -- patch, which is a huge thing to type when you're build. But I guess if you have it all saved, it won't be too bad. Russell thanked the participants in the discussion for their input and pointed to a pull request that would implement that said one with the sort of compliance option of having a flag there.
Oh, I'm disappointed. I wanted Route 13 to come to the rescue.
We'll just hide it. So it brought more light to this really opaque review process that Apple and these free software like Python projects have to deal with, especially these not free distribution platforms of Apple and Google. And anyway, these non-free platforms are making things kind of awkward. Oh, wait, I'm receiving a note. The EU has joined the chat. Anyway, sorry. So Python security model, there's an interesting discussion that happened, and this is another story that was on the PSF blog, the title being Python's Language Summit 2024, Python security model after the xz-utils backdoor. This is something that I think we touched on briefly when it was happening back in, I guess, March. This post is by Seth Michael Larson. If you don't remember the xz-utils story, or if it's new to you, I thought this was written really well, so I'll just read it because it's a kind of succinct way of pointing it out. The backdoor of the popular compression project xz-utils was discovered on Friday, March 29th, 2024 by Andres Frund. Andres is an engineer at Microsoft who noticed performance issues with SSH while contributing to the Postgres project. Andres wasn't looking for security issues, but after digging into the problem further, had discovered an attempt to subvert SSH logins across multiple Linux distros. This was a social engineering attack to gain elevated access to a project, also known as an insider threat. An account named Jia Tan had begun contributing to the xz-utils project soon after the original maintainer had announced on the mailing list that they were struggling with the maintenance of the project. We talk about this often in open source here, right? Through the use of multiple sock puppet accounts, pressuring the maintainer, and over a year of high-quality contributions, eventually Jia Tan was made a release manager for the project. There's a quote that's included. Jia Tan may have been a bigger role in the project in the future. He has been helping with a lot of off-list and is practically a co-maintainer already, smiley face. That was from an xz-utils maintainer. So over time, a series of small subversive changes were made to the project, all culminating in a tainted release artifact that put the backdoor in motion. Luckily for all of us, Andres discovered the attack before the new version was deployed more widely. So the question that was proposed at PyCon 2024 was, could this happen in CPython? This was brought up by Pablo Galindo Salgado, and he succinctly says yes. He brought this topic up during the Language Summit, and what could we do, meaning the CPython core team here, to improve Python's security model in the wake of this. So I won't get into the back and forth of it. The article kind of digs a little bit deeper into that, but some highlights were, should we change our approach? Quote unquote, is this a serious threat? I would argue that yes, it is. Who should be able to commit was another big one there. Who should have the commit bit? Should there be some kind of verification through in-person methods or even video calls? That one's shaky. You might dig and see some stories about not only video fakes, but also people doing an interview with a different person and then another person arriving at the job that they just received. Ideas about removing inactive people that are maintainers, simplifying the library, yet again, trim more changes and so forth. So discussion to continue. But it's interesting, that's something I think we need to think about in this age of these larger threats coming and potentially state actors wanting to get involved, and getting a backdoor in one of these open source projects that's distributed as widely as, again, xz-utils was in all these distributions of Linux, which was going to be huge, but also, something like Python would be pretty spooky. So something to keep a watch for.
Yeah, I think anytime you assess risk, there's what's the likelihood of something happening, and then there's what are the consequences, right? And
right.
I don't know that the likelihood's as high on this one, but the consequences are severe. What I think larger projects have going for them is, even if you do add a maintainer, there are other people watching the code. It's easy to put sort of code review kind of mechanisms in place. It's the mid-sized to small projects that are popular that I think where this is really a little more dangerous.
Yeah.
And the entire world is built on some of these, unfortunately, right? Like you've got smaller libraries with one or two maintainers, and it's horrible to think this way, but if state actors want, state actors will, right? Like there's,
Yeah. They have the money and the time and the bodies.
The in-person is okay. Oh, so we need somebody to show up at the conference. All right. It's like, where will we get one of those out of this large group of people who have been trained on how to convince other people that they're trustworthy? Yeah, maybe we'll use one of them, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, social engineering has been the linchpin to so many of those things over the years.
Yes.
It's just crazy.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not just watching necessarily the code and what's going on, but trust but verify. I don't know. There's all these different terms that we have out there.
It's hard.
This week, I want to shine a spotlight on another Real Python video course. It covers one of those built-in functions we discussed this week, and it can help you when you're working with multiple iterables in Python. The course is titled Parallel Iteration with Python's zip function. It's based on a Real Python article by Leodanis Pozo Ramos. And in the course, instructor Liam Pulsifer takes you through how to use the Python zip function for parallel iteration, how to create dictionaries on the fly using zip, and how to sort multiple iterables or make calculations on pairs, and how to do the reverse by unzipping a sequence. I think it's a worthy investment of your time to learn the zip function and start wrangling multiple iterables to solve real-world problems. And like most of the video courses on Real Python, it's broken into easily consumable sections. And where needed, you get code examples for the techniques shown. All of our course lessons have a transcript, including closed captions. Check out the video course. You can find a link in the show notes, or you can find it using the enhanced search tool on realpython.com. So what's your next one?
I've got an article called A Practical Introduction to Constraint Programming Using CPSAT and Python, which is a bit of a mouthful. The article's by Philippe Olivier, a fellow Canadian, which means I believe I'm legally obligated to make some sort of hockey joke. He's from Montreal. Our teams don't like each other. If you haven't come across constraint programming before, it's a particular kind of problem solving, typically where you have a set of data and are looking for a subset that meets some set of criteria. If you've ever done one of those logic problems where it talks like who is sitting next to whom at a dinner table, where the person eating steak is next to Alice and Bob is across from Fred, constraint programming helps you solve this kind of thing. There are actually programming languages that specialize in this. Prolog is one of them. But if you want to do it in Python instead, there are libraries that can help you out. So coding these kinds of problems is different from regular procedural programming. What you're doing instead is populating a model with values that describe the constraints, and then you have the library churn on that model to spit out a result. Debugging them can be gnarly. It kind of ends up feeling a little bit like magic. You set it up, you fill in the rules, and then you say go, and it spits out an answer. And of course, the only way you know whether or not it worked is to take the answer, then run it against your own constraints and see if it actually did work. So you kind of have to take the answer and spit it back to the model. I did some of this when I was in university. I always, anytime there was homework, I always did the problem by hand first. And of course, in the real world, if you're using this, you don't know the answer ahead of time. So you kind of have to get to this cycle of, spit it out and then verify it. So the first example that Philippe uses goes like this. Alice, Bob, and Carol each have $20 to pool together to purchase a $50 item. Alice will put in at least as much as Bob. Carol will only contribute in $5 increments, and none of them want to contribute the same amount. Now, Alice and Bob and Carol seem to be needy, but ignoring that, how much should each of them pay? So the constraints for this problem are that the sum of Alice, Bob, and Carol is $50. Alice is greater than or equal to Bob, and Carol mod 5 is 0. And finally, Alice is not equal to Bob, Alice is not equal to Carol, and Bob is not equal to Carol. So those are sort of programming versions of that problem that I just described. So the CPSAT library has a mechanism for writing these kinds of conditions in the code. You create a model object and then add constraints, and the constraints are expressed like Python conditions. Then it also has some utilities. So there's a method called all different. So instead of having to write 3 constraints of Alice is not Bob and Alice is not Carol and Bob is, you can just say all different Alice, Bob, Carol, and it takes care of it in one line. So once you've described all of those rules or those constraints in your model, then you create a solver, pass it the model, and say go. So for real-world applications, there are often multiple valid answers. This kind of tool is frequently used for planning, like employee scheduling. The example the post uses is a set of employees who work in 4-hour segments, have different skills, can't work more than 8 hours in a day, where the store is open 12 hours. And once you code all the constraints, the solver outputs a schedule that meets your needs. So if you've never played with constraint-based programming, this article is a great introduction. The world of coding is rather vast, and there are certain problem sets where a different approach can make a huge difference. And I think that's me attempting a segue into our discussion.
Yeah, this is intriguing to me. I'm playing a video game right now where this is a bit of my life by playing this game with my wife. It's called Aska, and it has this sort of thing where you have people that arrive and have certain skills, and you're like, okay, should they work at night? Should they work during the day? Got to keep those villagers happy, kind of thing. And you have to give them all these different separate jobs of what they would be good at, and sort of it's all about optimizing. And I'm eyeballing this library now because I've been figuring it out in my head, and I don't know how smoothly this is going.
Write yourself a little bot that helps you
play the game.
I'm
going to optimize Aska.
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, so I'm excited to dig into your discussion. You want to do the introduction here?
Sure.
Okay.
So we had a question that we are ripping off like we usually do, posted at Hacker News. The question was, has anyone successfully pivoted from web dev to AI ML development? The poster has been doing web dev full stack for 10 years and is interested in the whole ML data science kind of thing and wanted to know how to shift.
Yeah.
We wanted to broaden this question out a little bit, actually. Rather than being specific to web devs shifting to ML, I thought we'd discuss sort of shifting your specialization in general. We're both gentlemen of a certain generation and been in the field long enough that we've bounced around. I started out writing code for embedded systems, moved to web stuff, became an architect, did management consulting, became a VP of engineering at a startup. And you know what a VP of engineering at a startup does when there's 3 developers? Codes like everybody else. So full circle right back to the beginning, right? So this kind of is a natural thing that tends to happen in your career. And so understanding and thinking about it and how to do that is valuable. And in comparison to you, I was relatively linear. You've shifted around even more. So
I was writing down all my jobs and just to kind of look at them, and I'm like, oh my gosh. All right, well, there's 12 jobs of prior to programming. I've mentioned before that I went to college and I did study electrical engineering for a year, and I dropped out and did the music thing. Didn't win that gamble per se, but I had lots of different jobs where I finally ended up getting into teaching and training, and then relayed that when I moved to Hawaii. I was doing teaching and training there, and then I got the job doing SQL stuff and kind of actually fell in love with it. And so I started really with databases and kind of doing database programming stuff, and then that led to jobs in other banks where I'm working with, kind of taking a step back, working with things like Access. And then I started to build applications, did consulting, started building small business applications with tools like FileMaker Pro because it kind of made sense for these small businesses. And then did some web stuff because, again, small businesses needed those things. And then really landed on Python kind of late, but kind of fell in love with it. And then got the job with Real Python, which I probably talked about lots. And so there are members of my family that are just fascinated with me. This ability, you always seem to be able to land on your feet. And it's yeah, I'm always eager to learn, super curious. And I think wanting to learn and teaching are kind of like, the same coin, different sides of it. And then
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing that is part of my personality is just I really like helping other people and developing solutions and fixing problems, and doing the research to do that is something that excites me, and I get pleasure out of helping other people do stuff. So I feel like switching careers is definitely a kind of an amazing skill, in a way, and you need to know it. Not careers, switching,
Specialties.
platforms or tools or whatever, Yeah.
One of the things you come across sometimes is like people feel like they're locked in. So
Yeah.
what advice might you give to somebody who felt that way?
I guess, how do they feel locked in? Like, do they feel locked in because of they have to earn a certain amount of money, to continue? They feel like they can't learn something new, and that it's going to be too hard. I guess I would need to know a little more. I would ask them questions to kind of find out how they feel about certain stuff. To me, I guess I'm unique in the way that I don't feel that way ever.
Right.
I don't know how you share that optimism and willingness to explore things. I thought that the first answer in this thread was interesting because it was from Simon Willison, who I've wanted to get on the show, and I'm going to try to reach out shortly. But he talks about AI and ML stuff all the time. And he immediately threw out like, well, check out this course. You could start digging into there. And that's definitely something I do. I'm a person, when I find a new topic, I will voraciously dig in. And I did that with Python. And I think that's important. And he also points out something, that there are jobs that are in that industry that are probably less attainable, that are maybe would require the PhD or require other types of things to be in knowing how to train and fine tune a new model with the budgets and the things that you hear about that are involved there. Whereas learning how to build applications and production quality applications and tools like that, and knowing how to prompt things and build like solutions for other people, and taking the AI and ML tools and modifying them for end users is ripe. I mean, there's just lots of opportunities out there. I had a good conversation with Calvin Hendricks Parker about this, about tools like RAG, where you can augment an LLM and build things on top of it. And there's lots of places where you can get in right now and experiment with it, as opposed to like, I'm going to train my own model at home and here's my data set and so forth. It's possible on a small scale, but not probably the large scale sort of stuff. So,
And I think that's also part of why, things like doing a few courses is important. It's human nature to look at another field that grass is sort of greener.
Yeah.
And it looks simpler. And it's like, so talking about AI as a field is like talking about programming as a field.
Right. It's
right?
so wide right now. Yeah.
There's a huge number of different kinds of jobs, different kinds of salaries that go with those jobs, different requirements for each one of those jobs. And so taking a little bit of coursework and talking to some people who are in the field gives you a better idea of, okay, so what part of this do you actually find interesting? One of the things that I usually try to encourage people to do, you sort of commented when I asked you about the lock-in. One of the things that does happen, particularly as you get older, you've got family, you've got to pay the rent,
right,
all that kind of stuff. So, you can't necessarily just start out and go, well, I'll take half my salary and start again. It just isn't an option. There are often situations where you can find the job that's in your skill set that is with an organization that is in the space that you're hoping to shift to. So there was an example in the Hacker News post where somebody talked about sort of wanting to move into DevOps, and he just started taking on more and more of the CI/CD work for his team, and that built up that skill set.
Yeah.
And so by the time he had done that for a year, he went from doing 0% of it to doing like 80% of it. And then when he wanted to move on to his next job, whether that's a different department in the same organization or some other organization, now he's built up his resume. I've had a friend of mine go through this as well. He wanted to get into the machine learning space. He found it all interesting. He's coming out of the web dev space. And what he ended up doing was getting a job at a company that uses machine learning for certain kinds of problems. It sort of worked out for him. He didn't get as much machine learning expertise out of it as he thought he would. He still had to do a fair amount of web stuff, but at least he was getting some flavor of that. And, maybe his next job will change that balance a little bit. It's a little harder, I think, if you are trying to maintain the salary thing, because you kind of have to boil the frog a little bit. It's hard to jump into something new. I did have a dev that I hired once, second career in his 40s, had been a bartender at a Hells Angels bar.
Nice.
So different kind of lifestyle. And he'd liked programming as a kid and just sort of went, I have to have an adult style living now. And so he, took a couple college courses. And when he showed up at our door, he basically went, look, I will work for less than what your junior devs do. Ignore the fact that I don't have any hair. And I'm perfectly happy to work well below what you're under the understanding that I'm learning this. And, will you take the chance? And we did, because he seemed personable and he seemed eager.
And he's good with working with, large angry people and managing them.
Yes, exactly. That's always helpful. Put him in front of the customers. He'll know how to deal with them. And within a year, we promoted him up to what he would have been made if he come in the door, and he showed his value, right? So now he wasn't married, didn't have kids. And was perfectly happy to live in a basement apartment. And so your options are different depending on, what your life is and how that works.
So most of the changes that you've done across your career, were those things that you sought out or they found you?
It's a mix. The managerial stuff happened by accident because I was an architect at a place and my VP dev went on mat leave, and she went, how about not being an architect for 6 months and running the place? And so that was very much a sort of drop in the deep end of the ocean because the company needed help. Others, I tend to prefer smaller organizations over larger organizations. So I've got some network with the kinds of people who do startups. So every once in a while somebody pops up. And again, that's a place in life thing as well, right? So my wife makes decent money. We are able to live on one of our two salaries. So if one of us wants to do something a little more experimental, as long as only one of us is doing it at a time, that's fine. But that's a flexibility. That's a flexibility I have that not everybody's going to have, right? So,
that's I think kind of a crucial thing in that with a 2-income family, that's something that is a little more flexible.
It gives you options.
Yeah. And I could imagine the hesitation of anybody who doesn't have that potentially, or some kind of runway. And I mean, there's just so much turmoil that's happened across all this industry in the last year. You talk about all the layoffs and all the different things that are happening. So I can see a lot of people that are scratching their head right now, well, how do I pivot into these, what are the current roles that people are hiring for? And it's hard, it's like sometimes it's just like presented to you like this is what's open now.
And to come full circle, know the field enough before you start getting too far down that path is be careful if you are in that situation that you're not jumping out of the frying pan into the fire, right?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. It was an interesting thread to kind of read through. And it was kind of funny to see Simon at the top of it.
Yeah.
People were like commenting on it. It's like, it's not always that you get the person who developed, worked on Django as a commenter on your thread.
Yes, exactly.
Switching from web dev to AI. And he's definitely somebody who's done that with all the kind of commentary that he does. So cool. Well, that takes us into projects. Speaking on very smaller scale web dev, I have a project by James, goes by Cap James G on GitHub. The project called Aurora. It's a static site generator that's implemented in Python. Things that are kind of interesting about it, it's really fast. It can generate thousands of static web pages in seconds. It supports the Jinja 2 logic and templates, Markdown and HTML. It can generate pages from CSVs or JSON files. And then it has a hot reloading incremental static regeneration kind of feature that's in it. So you can kind of be coding and watching the page update as you work, which is interesting and powerful. It's got a few example sites in there. One is called Airport Pianos, which I think is a fun website where you can see a large number of airports that have a piano in them. I'm guessing that you can walk up and play, which is fascinating to me. Not too many in the US, but he has these short demo.
It's one in Denver near you, isn't there?
Is there a piano in there?
I seem to remember there is. I might be misremembering.
There could be.
I thought there was. I thought there was.
I guess I've been in such a hurry getting to my terminal. Sorry. Got to get to my gate. He has short demo videos showing the reloading functionality as things are changing. I think it's kind of a little more geared toward mostly text-based blogs. Many of the features that you'd want, definitely for a blog, things like the tagging systems and stuff like that is ready to go in it. If you're wanting something a little more complex with lots of media, it may not probably be the best fit for that. But he has his blog on there, which has like lots of different posts. He's used it for like 4 years. One last note, this is from the author at the bottom of the blog, sort of announcing the project. If you're looking for a Python static site generator, I would love for you to test Aurora and let me know what you think. The software is still in an early stage, so if you identify any bugs, please let them know. And so I thought that was kind of cool. So Aurora, what's your project this week?
I've got a project come article come project kind of thing.
Okay.
And in a move that might be heresy, it isn't even Python. So you're probably used to using tools like Black and Rough on your Python code. But if you're using a template engine like Jinja or Django's built-in template engine, you might want to lint that and format those template files as well. And in what seems to be a theme this week.
Yeah, I just noticed that.
Simon Willison has posted on his blog about using a JavaScript-based tool. It's a linter for these kinds of template files, and it's called Prettier. It's a command line tool. You don't really need to know JavaScript. You shouldn't care what language it's written in. You simply call it as part of your pipeline and run it on your template files. Why this post is relevant in a Python show is for those of us who don't spend a lot of time in NPM land, it can be a little finicky to get things going. Simon basically went, this was frustrating. I figured I should write it down. Maybe someone else will benefit from it. So he went through figuring out exactly how to get it going, how to get it running, and even put a little bash script together to make calling the utility easier. So if you're using Jinja or Django, this post is definitely worth checking out. After posting it, Simon got some feedback from readers, and he updated the post with 2 pure Python libraries that actually do the same thing. One is called curlylint, and the other is called the DJ-HTML, which I love. I haven't played with either of these yet, but if you're in this space, any of these 3 tools might be worth checking out.
Is that who you're going to hire for your wedding?
It's my DJ-HTML, yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for bringing all these articles and projects this week again, Christopher.
My pleasure. See you in a couple of weeks.
All right. And don't forget, installing Sentry is simple, like 5 lines of code simple. Use the code RealPython during signup, and new users get 3 free months of the team plan. So when your code breaks, you can fix it fast with Sentry. I want to thank Christopher Trudeau for coming on the show again. And I want to thank you for listening to the Real Python podcast. Make sure that you click that follow button in your podcast player. And if you see a subscribe button somewhere, remember that the Real Python podcast is free. If you like the show, please leave us a review. You can find show notes with links to all the topics we spoke about inside your podcast player or at realpython.com/podcast. And while you're there, you can leave us a question or a topic idea. I've been your host, Christopher Bailey, and I look forward to talking to you soon.